Hello there, and welcome to the third module in the Assessment Cluster series. This is Success Training Academy, supporting you with your TAE 40116 Certificate 4 in Training Assessment. Thank you so much for watching the webinars up till now. I hope that you have enjoyed them, and I know that you would have got massive value out of them. So let's get into the third module for the Assessment Cluster. Hopefully up till now you've watched the first two webinars on the assessment cluster, and it's starting to slowly sink in and make sense for you. The assessment cluster, it is a very broad skill set that you do need to develop, and there's a lot of stages that you need to go through when you are putting together assessments. So hopefully it's coming together piece by piece and it's making sense for you, okay? It's not something that you get overnight, and the webinars up till now, you may want to watch them multiple times just to get them at get the concepts at the deepest level possible. With assessment, you do need to follow a very systematic approach and make sure that you cover absolutely everything in the unit. And the other tricky thing is that there is no perfect assessment. There is no perfect way to assess, and there's no one standard way to assess. In the vet sector, you could find many variations of assessment, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure that everything from the unit is thoroughly assessed. And when someone receives or attains their qualification, that they actually have developed the skills, knowledge and structure to be able to perform the skills required in the workplace as strongly and competently as possible. So in this workshop, in this webinar, we're going to go through these steps involved in developing assessments. We're going to review that a little bit. We're going to look at the policy items that would need to go into assessments, providing instructions for the assessors and for the candidates, and certainly how to provide feedback to your candidates. All right. So as always, have a notepad available. Be prepared to do the activities as we go through them. Have a do not disturb sign on your desk, as we always say. Okay, so quick review of assessments and how they are made. All right, up till now we've gone through it in a little bit of detail quite a few times, but I really want you to understand the simple process we go through when we create assessments. So step one, read the performance evidence in the unit, as this will tell you what you must observe or the student must demonstrate to you and the evidence that must be gathered. Okay. Step two, read the assessment conditions to check under what conditions the assessment must take place, what equipment is needed, who can assess the unit. Okay, obviously you can read the assessment conditions first or the performance evidence first, up to you, but two critical places to start. Okay, third, read the knowledge evidence to see what knowledge the student must have when being assessed. Many knowledge evidence items can be integrated into the observation and practical task as well. All right. So previously, you might have thought you needed a knowledge evidence question for, you would need a question for every single knowledge evidence item. That's not necessarily the case. You may be able to interweave the knowledge into the practical task as well. And you'll understand that when we look at the mapping in a little bit more detail. So four, decide how you will assess each item and write it on the unit of competency. All right, so one thing I love to do is actually print off the unit itself and write with a pen on the unit itself how I would assess each item. And here's an example of what that might look like. So 1.1, literally write on the unit obs. 1.2, verbal Q&A, all right? 1.3, written test. 1.4 could be role play. 2.1 could be role play. 2.2, role play. 2.3 could be written test, all right? 2.4 could be observation again, all right? And my big hint is print off the unit and actually write on the unit itself. And then from there, you can go ahead and make a mapping document. Okay, so you use a mapping template and transfer your assessment ideas onto a mapping document. This can be a simple Excel spreadsheet. Okay, for your assessment, you'll actually find a mapping template in your assessment booklet. But if you go back to the webinar number 1 in the assessment cluster, you will see a couple of examples of mapping and what that looks like. Okay, now, number 6, make your observation checklist, practical task items. All right, so this is where you go ahead and start making your checklist and what you would actually want to see from the candidate as they do the task. Okay, remember you need to make it as practical, relevant to the workplace as possible, and the assessor must be able to pick up the checklist and know exactly what they need to see. So first thing you would do is create the observation checklist for the assessor, and the second part would be create a task sheet for the candidate. So let's do an example. Say that you were wanting to watch someone conduct CPR. Okay, so the first checklist item that you may create is a candidate does a visual search for any danger. Okay, second point, candidate sends for candidate checks for response from the patient. Okay. Now, when I say this, I'm just following DRS ABCD. Then this is just something I know off the top of my head. If I get it wrong, I'm sorry, but I just want to show you how we would create the criteria. So next one, number 3, could be S, send for help. So we would have a criteria. Candidate, after noticing the patient, calls for help on their mobile phone. Okay. Next checklist point, we could have candidate checks the airway of the patient to check that there is nothing stuck in the airway. Okay. Next checklist item, candidate looks and checks for breathing of the patient. Okay. Next checklist item, candidate notices that there is no breathing and immediately commences a CPR, placing hands in the correct position. Okay. Next checklist item, candidate does 30 compressions and 2 breaths at the appropriate depth on the chest. Next checklist item, candidate does the compressions at the appropriate speed of 120 seconds a minute, whatever it is, right? Next checklist item, candidate, while doing CPR, instructs fellow bystander to get defibrillator ready. Okay, so hopefully you can start to see how we are stepping out the task and we are stating exactly what the assessor must see as they are watching the candidate do the task. So another one, let's say making sandwiches, all right? So we are making a observation checklist on someone who makes sandwiches, right? So checklist item number 1, candidate checks the recipe. Now, checklist item number 2, candidate gets the appropriate ingredients and the exact ingredients out of the storage areas. Checklist number 3, candidate cuts the bread into the appropriate shapes. Okay. Checklist number 4, or 3 or 4, whatever I'm at to. You could say candidate butters the bread in the correct fashion and uses the correct knife. Okay, so hopefully again you're starting to pick up how we would create our checklist items for the observation checklist. Okay, so also another way to think about it or relate to it could be, imagine you are watching somebody drive a car. Okay, well what specifically would you want to see the candidate do? Okay, let's think of another example that's going to strongly relate to your assessment. Let's say that we have a coffee shop barista serving customers. Okay, so checklist item number 1 could be when a customer approaches the shop attendant smiles and greets them appropriately and asks them what they want. Checklist item number 2, the barista confirms their order and writes it down. Checklist item number 3, candidate starts making the cup of coffee and makes the coffee with the right ingredients, specifically this, and this. Next checklist item, candidate makes a cup of coffee within a period of 6 to 10 minutes. Okay, so hopefully again you can start to see the checklist items as they would flow from the task itself. Okay, so I highly encourage you to start to practice making observation checklists, and even on a day-to-day task, just think about, all right, well, if I was going to watch someone do this, what specifically would I want to see as they are doing it, okay? And the more practice you get with writing observation checklists, the easier they become. So obviously you're going to have the checklist item, and then underneath that, you would say, what specifically does the assessor need to see? Okay, so for example, we may say that the assessor must hear the candidate say XYZ to the customer as they are doing it. Okay, so one of the things that we really need to be specific on is candidate pours the milk. Okay, great. But then underneath that, we're going to say exactly what the assessor must see the candidate do in terms of pouring the milk. All right, so we may be more specific on the angle of how the milk is poured and things like that. All right, and as you're in the vet sector, you're going to come across a range of different types of observation checklists, but the more specific they are, the better they will be, because the higher the probability that you're going to get consistency across all assessors. Okay, so hopefully that explanation has made sense to you. And I encourage you to look at a variety of observation checklists out there and get a sense of the different range of specificity you might come across. Okay. Now, number 7, make your written test or verbal interview test. Okay, make the written questions for the candidate, absolutely. Then make the marker's guide and benchmark answers. Okay, so in the previous webinar, we talked about different questions that you could create. And of course, you need to create the question and you need to create the marker's guide as well. Okay, point number 8, make your role play assessment. Okay, if you're doing a role play, well, that would require that you have a task sheet to give the student, and you would also have a marker's guide or a checklist for the assessor. Okay, so they're going to have things that they tick off as they watch the student do the task. Okay. 9, make your case study. Okay, so if you're doing case studies, absolutely you need to make those. So you make the question sheet for the student and you make the marker's guide for the assessor. Okay. Number 10, make your project. If you're doing a project, that would require you to make the project task sheet for the student and make the marker's guide for the assessor that stipulates what performance and the evidence should look like in terms of the project. Okay, so just going through these are just all the options that you may end up creating when you're putting together your assessment tool. Okay, so not every unit is going to have a role play or an observation or a written test. You're going to pick the combination and structure that works for you when you're assessing the unit. And a lot of times people say, is this the right way to do it? Is that the right way to? And my typical response is, I don't know. It's up to you and your judgment. If you think that's the best way to assess it, great. But you would definitely need to be able to justify your answer. Okay, now, in terms of your assessment though, I believe in your assessment we actually ask you to create an observation checklist, a verbal interview, a written test, and then there's a third-party report as well. So there's a variety that we ask you to do because we want you to be able to be competent in being able to write all different types of assessments. Okay. Number 11, trial your assessment with a colleague or mock student or industry experts. Okay. So these are steps that you would go through in making your assessments. Number 12, you would gather feedback and you would make changes based on the feedback that you've got there. Use the assessments on live candidates for sure. Do a final validation of the assessment after a period of time. Now, this basically just means sitting down with colleagues and reviewing the assessments to make sure that the assessments are still working and giving you the evidence that you need. Okay, and then last of all, after the validation, you want to make changes if required. Okay. Now, let's have a chat about policy items for assessment. Each of the items listed on this slide here are very, very important. So when you're discussing assessments with candidates, you need to mention all of these things. So expectations for performance, pass mark, absolutely, the appeals policy, reasonable adjustment, resubmission policy, how to submit, WHS, student declaration, plagiarism policy, and feedback. And we're going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail. But one of the things that you need to be aware of with assessment is that if there's no policy around it, you've got really no leg to stand on. And one of the biggest things you need to be aware of is that students have the right to appeal an assessment decision, okay? And you need to make sure that anything and everything that you do in the assessment world, you certainly can back up, okay? So let's check out the admin items. Policies and procedures are critical when it comes to assessment. So expectations for performance, how would we state that to a candidate, okay? So example instructions to a candidate. You will be required to perform the following range of tasks to workplace standard. Okay, greet, welcome and serve customers, take their orders and keep all aspects of the restaurant flowing smoothly. In order to achieve competency for this task, you will need to carry out all duties in a polite, efficient manner. If you have any questions at all, please ask your assessor before the observation commences. Note, you'll be assessed for approximately 2 hours. All right. Now, these instructions are very clear, concise, and a candidate would know exactly what they need to do in order to achieve competency for this observation task. Okay. Next one, expectations for performance for a written test. All right, you are required to answer each of the following questions in this written test provided. It is a closed book, open book test. You will have approximately 20 minutes, if not more, however you decide. All your answers must be in blue or black pen only. All work must be your own answers. This test will be done under supervision of your assessor. All right, so those are types of words or instructions that we could write if we were putting together a written test. Your answers will be assessed against the following criteria: that they are valid, authentic, current, sufficient. Okay, when it says authentic, we could say no plagiarism identified. Current, your answers are up to date. Sufficient, you provide enough detail to answer the question. Please make sure to sign all spaces where you are requested to do so and include your name and date on the student declaration. Failure to do so will deem you not yet competent. All right? So those are types of instructions that we could put at the top of a written test. Okay, now pass mark. It's a bit of a bone of contention for a few. However, ultimately in the vet sector, all of your assessments, you must make the pass mark 100%. Okay, so a student, in order to pass an assessment instrument, i.e. an observation, they have to get everything correct. Okay, if it was a written test, they would have to get everything correct. In the vet sector, we don't talk about A plus, B minus, C minus, or that. We don't grade students. Unfortunately, we can't. However, in the vet sector, we talk about competent or not yet competent. And in order to be competent, they have to get every single thing correct. Okay, and what I mean by correct is satisfactory. So all satisfactory items equal the unit being competent. Okay. There are some times where you may see 80% or 75% pass mark. That is just unallowed in the industry, and if you ever see it, just be wary of it. The only other time that you may see it is if the item is being assessed in multiple ways across a range of different methods. So for example, maybe the item is being assessed observation, written test, and a role play, and the item is being assessed in multiple ways, right? And maybe it's been allowed that they get one or two wrong on one of those ways, providing that they get it correct on the other ways, that would be fine, okay? But it gets a little bit mucky, so you ultimately just want to have the pass mark of 100%, okay? So, now, pass mark. In observation, in order to achieve competency on the task, you will be required to perform all tasks to a satisfactory standard as deemed by your assessor. Okay. Written test. In order to achieve competency in this test, you'll be required to answer all questions correctly as per the unit requirements. Okay. Appeals policy. Very, very important one. All right. You do not want students appealing and you don't have a policy around it. Okay. Because appeals do happen. At XYZ RTO, we provide all candidates with the opportunity to appeal an assessment decision following their assessments. This can be submitted in writing via an email to the insert appropriate person at the following email address. Okay, so that's what you can put at the beginning of your assessment instructions. Okay, the appeal will be considered and a reply will be sent within X period of time. In your appeal request, please include your reasons for the request, date and time of the assessment that you undertook. Okay. Next, reasonable adjustment. Okay. As part of the assessment that you will be undertaking this unit, if for any reason you feel that there is an aspect of your assessment that you are unable to undertake as per the prescribed instructions, you are to inform the assessor immediately, and an application for reasonable adjustment in how the assessment takes place will be considered. This may relate to any location, physical, or learning challenges that you may have. At XYZ RTO, we believe in fair and equal assessment for all candidates, and as part of the assessment, we provide opportunities for reasonable adjustment on how you undertake your assessments if required. If you have any special circumstances that would prevent you from being assessed as per the instructions below, please inform your assessor and place your request in writing for reasonable adjustment to be applied. Okay, so ultimately you want to put the onus back on the students as much as you can. and definitely get them to fill out a form to request that reasonable adjustment. You do not want assessors just willy-nilly granting reasonable adjustment. Okay? So reasonable adjustments as part of instructions. For those that currently face reading or writing challenges, this test may be undertaken via an oral interview. However, prior application must be made and approved by the academic manager. Okay, I'm just going to note down the bottom there. Every RTO will be different in how they facilitate and organise reasonable adjustment. Okay, so just be aware of that. All right, resubmission policy. If for any reason you are deemed not yet competent, you will have the opportunity to reset the assessment. This is to be arranged with your assessor, and he or she will inform you of the next suitable time and date to do this. You will have 2 resubmission attempts. Following this, you'll be required to pay an reassessment fee of X dollars. You'll be required to re-enroll in the course. Okay. How to submit and timeline for completion. Submission. You are required to submit your assessments via email, direct to your assessor, via post, upload to Dropbox, upload to the student portal. Okay, whatever strategy or approach that you would like to implement, you can certainly do that. Okay, it's your RTO, it's the assessor, whatever, right? But we have to actually tell our students how they are to submit their assessments. Okay. Timeline. You will have up to 12 months to complete all of your assessment. Any late assessments or submissions will require a late fee of X or a re-enrollment application. Okay. So these are just different types of wording that you can play with, okay? And often in life, if you haven't been exposed to the wording, then you're just not exactly sure what to write, okay? Example of WHS. Prior to the assessment taking place, the assessment area is to be inspected for any hazards or potential risks. All PPE must be worn by candidates where required, including, and that's where you would actually list out the PPE. Okay. All precautions must be taken by the assessor and candidate to show duty of care to all individuals involved, and the assessment is to be ceased immediately if any party is put in immediate danger. Okay. All might seem like obvious stuff, but you can't ever assume. Okay. Student declaration. Now, the purpose of the student declaration is for them to prove authenticity to you. However, it can occasionally be a little bit tricky if it's an online course, and you would definitely want to grab a photo ID, and you definitely want to grab a signature and even cite a driver's license if you can. Okay. But students must sign a student declaration so that they are declaring any work is their own and they haven't plagiarized. Okay, so I've been advised that the assessment requirements have been made aware of my rights and responsibilities as assessment candidate and choose to be assessed at this time. The assessment contains my own work, except where I've made due reference to work by others. I'm aware that any false declaration may lead to withdrawal of a qualification or statement of attainment. Candidates must provide a real signature if submitting your portfolio electronically. Either insert an electronic signature in the space bar or print the page, sign it, then submit a scan of the signed page. Okay. Plagiarism policy. At XYZ RTO, we treat plagiarism very seriously. If there are any doubts that assessment answers or evidence provided is not that of the original owner, you may be required to resubmit further evidence and be reassessed. In extreme cases, you'll be removed from the program. Okay, every RTO treats plagiarism a little bit differently. However, that there is a little bit of a standard statement. Okay, feedback. All right, we adhere to the policy of two-way feedback and invite you to provide your comments on the assessment process for this group of units at the conclusion. We thank you for taking this seriously, as your contribution is greatly appreciated in our attempt to continually improve our assessment system and processes. You'll be provided with formal and informal feedback from your trainer or assessor at regular intervals throughout the course of study to assist you in this learning process and in gaining competency in this unit. You also receive a formal assessment report at the end of your assessment task, as well as a transcript for units that you complete. Okay, so again, this is just some verbiage that you can use. You can change it up however you want. Okay, key takeaways. Number one there, document everything. Document every policy, procedure, and thing that could eventuate. Make sure that you are thoroughly aware of what systems that you have in place. Okay. Number two, set the expectations up front. And number three, no policy, no leg to stand on. basically is the way that I say it. And the more that you are in business, the more policies you're going to develop, because the more policies you realize that you actually need to have. Okay. So now you must make your assessments user-friendly and level appropriate. Love this little image here. And let's get into it. Let's remind ourselves about the STA qualifications framework and the different levels that we've got here. All right. I've shown this slide a number of times because I really want you to get acquainted with the fact that we've got various levels and we've got various expectations all along. And in the last webinar, we really went into the differences between a Cert 1, 2, 3, 4 diploma and how the questions may be structured. Okay. This time, we just need to remind ourselves that the quality of the question will determine the quality of the answer. And occasionally you will get students that will give you very literal answers. So for example, in which battle did Napoleon die? In his last battle. Okay, of course he did, right? Where was the Declaration of Independence signed? At the bottom of the page. Of course it did. Of course it was, right? What looks like half an apple? Well, the other half of the apple. Okay. Now, if you think about it, the answers that the students given us are not wrong. Okay, they're not wrong, but they are not what we really wanted as an assessor. And we need to remember that the quality of the question determines the quality of the answer. All right, and I'll say it again. The quality of the question determines the quality of the answer. Quality of the question determines the quality of the answer. If we're not getting the answer we want, we need to change the what? The question, okay? It just makes logical sense to go, okay, cool. That's not the output I wanted. I need to change the input. However, sometimes assessors get into the habit of just blaming student. Blame, it's the student's fault, student's fault, student's fault, student's fault. Yet, if we want a different result, we need to change the question, okay? So let's put together a few items for the checklist, all right? So as I was going through the checklist before, and I was sort of describing some examples for CPR and the coffee shop and different things, I was sort of giving you some examples of what would go into an observation checklist. Now, let me show you some more examples of that. Okay, now this is for the unit, for example, BSB, CMM, make a presentation. All right, so a checklist item could be, at the beginning of the presentation, the speaker specifically mentions the topic, mentions the agenda, and mentions the outcome of the presentation. So you would obviously have a tick box over here, which would be satisfactory or not satisfactory, that the assessor would be able to go through and tick. Okay. So 2.2 from the unit, use presentation aids, materials and examples to support target audience understanding of key concepts and central ideas. So what we could do if we were putting that into an observation checklist item, while presenting, a variety of presentations are used. Circle, yes or no, and then it could be, these may include PowerPoint, flip charts, handouts, okay? So again, just another example of how we can take this and turn it into an observable item, okay? Now, let's take a look at the knowledge evidence, and if we're creating a written test on these knowledge evidence items, all right? Describe culturally appropriate communication techniques. So a question we could ask about that would be, tell me 2 ways that you would ensure you didn't offend people from a different culture other than your own during a meeting. Okay. Describe 1 technique to bridge communication across different cultures in a meeting. Okay. So here's another one. So verbal question, tell me 3 things that you would include in a meeting agenda. All right, so again, we've got an item here which is from the unit organized meetings, and identify the relevant formats for agendas and meetings. Okay, so we've got to test someone's ability to do that. So we create a question. Here's the question. Tell me 3 things that you would include in a meeting agenda, or what are 3 things would you always make sure that you include in meeting minutes? Okay, so next one, another word. All right, so identify the legislation that applies to working effectively in a business environment. So this is from the unit BSB IND 201, work effectively in a business environment. And this is a criteria from the unit. Question that we have created, what are 3 pieces of legislation that could apply to working in a business environment? Explain how they would be used. Provide an example for each. Okay, so all I'm doing here is showing you snapshots of different items from the units and then how we would turn that into a question. All right, that's pretty much all it is. And I really want you to catch the concept of, okay, here's a standard, here's a criteria, now let me turn that into a question. Okay. Outline the organizational documents that are relevant to working effectively. Okay, so this is from the unit Work Effectively in a Business Environment. And you can even Google it and see where that is. And then let's check out the question we created. Within your job role, what are 3 documents that you reference regularly in order to help you carry out your duties effectively? Okay. So we're outlining organizational documents relevant to working effectively. I need to test somebody's knowledge and understanding of organizational documents. So I'm going to create a question around organizational documents, and I come up with this question here. Okay. So now, case studies, what would they look like? Well, if we wanted to test this one here from the unit SIWHS 002, contribute to workplace health and safety, okay? So we've got the criteria 3.2 here, report work health and safety issues and concerns as they arise, all right? So we're going to test that. We're going to test that from this unit, okay? So if we wanted to test it via using a case study, we would go, okay, at your current company, Jim, a fellow worker who was doing a cleaning job on the outside windows, while cleaning, he was not wearing his PPE and slipped and fell from the scaffolding. There were people around at the time who noticed him not dressed appropriately. What should have happened in order to prevent Jim's accident from happening, and how should the fellow workers show a duty of care in this situation? All right, so we've said here a minimum of 200 words. Okay. So a case study, all it is creating a scenario and then questions around that scenario. Okay, hopefully that's made sense for you. Now, rules of evidence. As we've talked about, an answer in the vet sector, in order to be satisfactory, must meet 4 criteria. Those 4 criteria are, let me go back a little bit. Valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. Valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. And as we've talked about, valid means that the answer is correct. Authentic means that the answer is the candidate's own work. Current means that the answer is up to date. S, satisfactory, means that S means sufficient, and essentially that means that the answer is long enough. The answer is long enough, okay? So let's get into further definitions. The assessor is assured that the learner has the skills, knowledge, and attributes described in the module or unit of competency and associated assessment requirements. In summary, the student's answer is correct, okay? Authentic. The assessor is assured that the evidence presented for assessment is the learner's own work. In summary, the student's answer can be proven to be their own, okay? Current. The assessor is assured that the assessment evidence demonstrates current competency. This requires the assessment evidence to be from the present or the very recent past. In summary, the student's answers are up to date. And the way that I like to think about currency, or the answers are current, or the evidence is current, is that it is from the last 2 years, okay? So for example, if someone gives you an answer that's out of date, that's more than 2 years old, you would probably mark that answer as not current. Okay. Sufficient. The assessor is assured that the quality, quantity, and relevance of the assessment evidence enable a judgment to be made of the learner's competency. In summary, the learner's answers are long enough. Okay. So let's look at some real life examples and how we would apply the rules of evidence. Okay, so number 1, what does RTO stand for? Okay, student answer, Registered Training Octopus. Obviously that's not correct, but think about, why is it not correct? Is it not valid, not authentic, not current, not sufficient? Number 2, RPL evidence provided is 10 years old. It isn't valid, authentic, current, or sufficient. Number 3, candidates perform CPR for 1 minute. Unit stipulates 2 minutes. Their performance isn't valid, authentic, current, or sufficient. Number 4, student has written their answer in pencil. Evidence isn't valid, authentic, current, sufficient. Okay. Number 5, student writes 1-word answer for a qualification that starts with describe in a certain full qualification. The answer isn't valid, authentic, current, sufficient. Which is it? Number 6, RTOs need to keep student records for 8 years. The answer isn't valid, authentic, current, or sufficient. What do you think? Okay, so let's go back to number 1. What does RTO stand for? All right, it's Registered Training Octopus. What would we say? Valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. Well, hopefully you have chosen it is not valid, okay? Because the answer is absolutely not correct. Registered Training Octopus is not correct. It obviously stands for Registered Training Organisation. Okay. Number 2, RPL evidence provided is 10 years old. Well, in this case, we would say the evidence is not current. Candidate has performed CPR for 1 minute. Unit stipulates 2 minutes. Their performance isn't, what would we say? It's not sufficient. Okay. Number 4, student has written their answer in pencil. Evidence isn't valid, authentic, current, sufficient. Well, in this case, we would say the answer isn't authentic, because possibly there could be some doubts around authenticity of the answer. Okay. Now, number 5, student writes a one-word answer for a question that starts with describe in a Cert 4 qualification. The answer isn't, what do we think? It's not sufficient because they haven't put in enough detail to answer the question to Cert 4 level. Number 6, RTOs need to keep records for 8 years. Well, the answer is absolutely not valid. Okay, RTOs need to keep records for 7 years, paper copy and hard copy for 7 years, and then yes, and records of qualifications issued certainly need to be kept for 30 years for sure. Okay, so now, assessment review. As per the standards of and RTO's fact sheets, validation is a process that we usually use in order to check the quality of our assessments and to check the quality on a regular basis to make sure that the questions are working, so to speak. They are still meeting industry standards, and any changes that need to be made are identified, and maybe some of the questions are not getting the answers that the unit actually needs. So we do a validation on not just the assessments themselves, but also the evidence that our students provide and the marking that's done. Okay, so validation activities are generally conducted after assessment is complete, so that an RTO can consider the validity of both assessment practice and judgments. Okay, so when it says judgment, it means decisions by the assessor. Validation involves checking that your assessment tools have been produced valid, reliable, sufficient, current, and authentic evidence that allows your RTO to make reasonable adjustments about whether training product requirements have been met. The validation process involves reviewing a statistically valid sample of the assessments and making recommendations for future improvements to the assessment tool, process, and or outcomes if applicable. That probably means nothing to you, but a way to put it is if you taught 100 students, then ideally you want to be looking at reviewing 10 to 20 of those assessments just to make sure that the assessments are working and the answers provided by the students are meeting the criteria. Okay, so where it says statistically valid sample, that's what it's talking about. It's actually talking about the amount of students that you would double check. Okay, and the amount of assessments you would double check. All right. The validation process must also include acting upon any recommendations for future improvement. So it's very important to identify things that need to be changed, but also more important than that, it's critically important to actually make the changes. Okay. So what is checked? Well, in a validation, they check assessment marking for student answers against the marking guide. They check the mapping, okay? Are items mapped accurately? Are assessment tasks valid? Okay? Are assessment questions causing problems for any students? What could be improved? Have the packaging rules changed? Have any of the units been updated? Okay, you definitely want to check that out because sometimes updates happen and people forget to update their assessments. Has anything changed in the industry recently? Okay, has industry engagement been updated? All right. So just a piece of terminology, validation versus moderation. Okay, validation, simple way to put it is when you are checking the quality of the assessments after a certificate has been issued to a student. Moderation is when you are checking the quality of the answers before the student has been issued with their certificate. Okay, so this is when two or more assessors will get together and just to discuss an assessment decision and whether or not they all agree whether the student is satisfactory and competent. Validation is checking it after the certificate has already been issued. Okay. So, moderation is quality control process aimed at bringing assessment judgments into alignment. Okay, everybody agrees on the standards for the assessment decisions. Moderation is generally conducted before the finalisation of student results, as it ensures the same decisions are applied to all assessment results within the same unit of competency. Okay. Moderation is a strong suggestion, but not mandatory under the standards for RTO. So an RTO doesn't have to do moderation, but an RTO must do validation. Okay. Validation is compulsory and you must have a 5-year plan for it. 50% of your scope of qualifications must be validated within the first 3 years. So what that means is if you're an RTO and you are teaching a number of courses, 50% of your courses must be validated within the first 3 years. Okay. Things to consider before the assessment: go through your assessment plan and make arrangements for assessment. How is the candidate to respond? Do you have access to all the ways of recording the performance and collecting evidence, checklists, audio, visual equipment, and things like that? Do candidates need specialist support? What reasonable adjustments need to be made to the assessment tasks? Okay. So you want to make sure that you are fully prepared to run the assessment. Now, this is a task outcome sheet, aka just a assessment report. Okay, so in this case, we've got assessment 1, 2, 3. And then over here, we would put whether it's satisfactory or not yet satisfactory. We'll put the date and then the assessor initials. Okay. And you would also have a spot down the bottom there for comments for the student as well. And we've got student name, assessor names, assessor signature, date. Okay, so this is a form that you may come across in your RTO. Okay, now feedback to candidates. Very important that we don't limit our feedback and we don't restrict it to good job, well done. All right. With feedback, the most important thing we need to remember is that a student must hear and know why they got a particular result. All right, so feedback must include the magic word of because. All right, so great work because you actively engaged your audience and had great eye contact throughout your presentation and used fantastic images and checked in with students regularly. I mean, that is great feedback that really would empower a candidate after they've done a task. All right, so in this case, they've done the task of a presentation. Okay, now let's look at the feedback you might give them if they didn't get satisfactory. So for example, your answer for question 3 is not yet satisfactory because it doesn't meet the criteria, criteria of validity and it isn't the correct answer. Please check Learner Guide page 3 to 6 for the more correct answer and please do further study. Okay, or authenticity. We need more of a personalized response. Okay. Or currency, you need to update your answer as it isn't the most up-to-date answer for this industry. Or sufficiency, you will need to add more to your answer as it doesn't have enough detail or explanation. Okay, please organize the time to resubmit the items in question. Please email your adjusted answer. Okay, so whenever I give feedback, I love to include the rules of evidence, valid, authentic, current, sufficient, as this will really inform a student as to where they may have gone wrong. Okay, so recording results, you definitely need to record results on that feedback form, and often those feedback forms or feedback reports will need to go to the compliance department. And ultimately, the student will receive a feedback form and their certificate for sure. Okay, but in terms of records, we certainly must keep physical hard copies of the assessment. Okay, and we need to do that for 6 months. Okay, then we can put everything electronic. We need to keep records of qualifications issued for sure. We need to keep a vet miss data, and that is something that is reported to the government in terms of who is enrolling and in what qualifications. USI data, we certainly need to keep that updated. User choice programs for funding, we need to keep records of students that are enrolled in that. Okay, so records are critically important to keep as part of the assessment process. Record storage. It is implied by the standards for RTO operations that records are kept in a organised, well-sequenced, flood-proof, fire-proof and hacker-proof fashion. Common practice is for data to be backed up to an external hard drive, cloud software, or cloud-based LMS that can be accessed remotely. All right? Every RTO is going to handle record storage a little bit differently. However, storing records safely is critically important. Okay? Seeking feedback, you definitely want to grab feedback from your learners as to how they found the assessment process. All right, so you may get them to fill out a feedback form on the assessment and on you as an assessor. That certainly happens quite often as well. Okay, so it's not just feedback from a student after they go through your training delivery, but also from the assessment. Okay, post-assessment, we've already talked about moderation and validation, and those are practices that you would do quite often. And you may also do an internal audit, and that's just to be done annually. Okay, so an internal audit is basically inside the RTO, everyone getting together and going through every single standard within the standards for RTOs and making sure the RTO has everything in place that it needs to have, and everything is up to date and everything is accurate. In an internal audit, your company will probably check the following details. Is the TAS up to date? If you're not sure or you can't remember what a TAS is, go back to the design cluster and rewatch that section. Are industry consultation details up to date? Trainer details up to date. Now what this means is the right trainer actually recorded down as the trainer, and also do they actually have their professional development up to date? Are details on the website accurate about the courses current and correct? Okay, because maybe in your TAS you say that the course is a 3-month course, but on the website you say it's a 2-month course. All right, so you need to make sure that those things are accurate. Are trainers' details current and correct? Again, has anyone left your company but still mentioned on the TAS? All right, are markers guides up to date? Are validation records up to date? Is a continuous improvement log up to date? All right, so these are all the things that you would definitely check in an internal audit. Okay, so that is today's final learning module in the assessment cluster. Let's do a quick review. Okay, so in the very beginning of this learning module, we looked at how assessments are typically made. So we went through the steps that you would go through. All right, so the steps, and we looked at the art of actually printing off the unit, writing on the unit, how you as an assessor have decided to assess the unit. Okay, and then we looked at the further steps, making your obs, all right, and the documents required for an observation checklist, making a written test, the the items required for the written test. Okay, items required for a role play, items required for a case study, items required for a project, and then the further steps. Okay. Policies, we went through each of these policies and how you would write them in the assessment tool. Okay, and we just looked through each of them and how that could really impact assessment. Okay, and then we certainly looked at each of those policies, as I said. All right, and then we revisited the AQF. Okay, AQF chart. Okay, we talked about the fact that the quality of the question will determine the quality of the answer. If you want a different answer, you need to change the question. All right, so we looked at some random excerpts from a unit and how we could turn that into either an observation checklist item or into a written test question. Okay, and then we looked at creating a case study from an excerpt from a unit. Okay, we looked at the criteria for a good answer, which is valid, authentic, current, sufficient. Okay, we looked at definitions of each of those, and we put that into practice with a bit of quiz. Assessment review, we talked about what validation is and what you check in a validation. Okay, we looked at the difference in validation and moderation. Okay, and we looked at recording outcomes, feedback to candidate, how to give quality feedback as opposed to bad feedback. Okay, and we looked at how we can integrate the rules of evidence into our feedback. Okay, recording results, records that must be kept, record storage, very important, seeking feedback from our candidates, okay, and then we finally looked at an internal audit and what you would check if you did an internal audit, all right? So hopefully the assessment cluster has really started to come together for you and you're starting to get a sense of how it all plays out. So as I said, you check the unit, you come up with the best strategies that you think to test the unit, you write those down and you create each of the assessment methods, the assessment documents, and then you trial it, and then you get reviewed, and then you make modifications, and then you test, you give the test to a live candidate, and then you mark them, okay? And that's pretty much the process that you go through, and of course you validate the assessment instruments and validate the results, and then you fix it up, and you go through the cycle again and again and again. And yes, assessments, there are so many different ways that it can be done, and you're going to find that different RTOs will even build and develop assessments differently as well. However, fundamentally, it must include all the items from the unit, okay? And because it's so open to interpretation, that is why you regularly have validations. And you also include people from industry to bring in and share their opinion as well. All right, so this is the final learning module in the TAE program. There may be further learning modules developed and released. However, up till now, you should have watched the LN learning module, the design cluster, the delivery cluster, and this is the assessment cluster. So thank you so much for your time, energy, and focus, and we look forward to seeing you at the workshop, or if you've already gone through your workshop, congratulations, and good luck in completing all of your assessments and submitting everything that you need to for your assessments. Thank you so much, and good luck.